The gunshot echoed across the ridge just as Yates bent to pluck a cluster of Indian paintbrush from the rocky soil, and he froze with his fingers wrapped around the stem, knowing that sound meant trouble was heading toward the settlement below. He finished picking the flower with the same methodical precision he used when loading his Winchester, adding it to the small bundle already gathered in his calloused hand. The year was 1878, and Fort Sumner, New Mexico, was the kind of place where a man learned to finish what he started before dealing with whatever hell came next. Finn was 26 years old, lean and weathered from years working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, with hands that knew rope and leather better than anything soft. He had been staying at the Miller Ranch for 3 weeks now, helping repair fences and break horses, trying to figure out what to do with himself after his own family's small spread up north had been lost to drought and debt. The wildflowers were a foolish thing, maybe, but every morning for the past 5 days he had climbed this ridge at dawn and picked whatever was blooming. And every morning he had walked down to the boarding house where she took her breakfast and left them on her table before she arrived. Her name was Eleanor Kimball, and she had arrived in Fort Sumner 6 months ago with her father, a surveyor who had died of pneumonia within 2 months of their arrival. She was 23, with dark hair that she wore pinned up in a way that made Finn think of thunderclouds before a storm, and eyes that were some color between green and brown that changed depending on the light. She worked now as a teacher in the small schoolhouse, though there were only 11 children in town who attended with any regularity. Finn had never spoken more than a handful of words to her, had never even told her the flowers were from him, but something about her made him climb that ridge every morning like it was a duty more important than any other. He started down the slope now, moving fast, the flowers still clutched in his left hand while his right stayed near the revolver on his hip. The shot had come from the direction of the Hondo River, maybe 2 miles south, and while it could have been a hunter or a rancher dealing with a rattlesnake, instinct told him otherwise. Fort Sumner had been quiet lately, too quiet, and the kind of men who drifted through New Mexico territory in these years were often the kind looking for easy targets. The boarding house sat on the eastern edge of town, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning sun. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had ended up in New Mexico through a circuitous route that involved a failed marriage and a successful poker game, ran the place with efficiency and surprisingly good cooking. She was already setting out plates when Finn came through the back door, and she glanced at the flowers in his hand with an expression that might have been amusement. "You are consistent," she said in English that carried only the faintest accent. "She will be here in 10 minutes. "Did you hear that shot?" Finn asked, setting the flowers on the small table by the window where Eleanor always sat. "I heard it. Martinez rode out to check." Mrs. Chen paused, studying him. "You should talk to her. Words work better than flowers." "Flowers work fine," Finn said, though he felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. "Flowers without a name are anonymous. Anonymous gifts make women nervous, not charmed." Finn had no answer for that, so he headed back toward the door, intending to check on whatever had caused that gunshot. He was halfway across the porch when he nearly collided with Eleanor herself, coming up the steps with a canvas bag full of slates and books slung over her shoulder. She caught herself on the railing, and Finn reached out automatically to steady her, his hand closing on her elbow. "I am sorry," she said quickly. Her voice was lower than he had expected the first time he heard it, with an Eastern accent that spoke of education and cities, though he had learned she was originally from Ohio. "I was not watching where I was going. My fault," Finn said. Up close, he could see that her eyes were more green than brown today, and there was a small scar at the corner of her mouth that he had never noticed before. "I was moving too fast." She looked at him for a moment, really looked, and Finn felt something shift in his chest like a horse adjusting its weight. Then she stepped back, smoothing her dark blue dress, and offered a small smile. "You work for Mr. Miller, do not you? Helping out, yeah." It was the longest conversation they had ever had, and Finn found himself searching for words to extend it. "You heading to the schoolhouse after breakfast?" She glanced past him toward the door. "Mrs. Chen makes the only decent coffee in town." "It is good coffee," Finn agreed, then felt like an idiot for such a useless statement. He stepped aside to let her pass, catching the scent of soap and something floral that might have been lavender. She moved past him into the boarding house, and he stood there on the porch like a fool for several seconds before shaking himself and heading down the steps. Martinez, the town's part-time deputy, was riding back in from the south, his horse lathered and his face grim. Finn intercepted him in front of the general store, where several other men were already gathering. "What happened?" asked Samuel Porter, who owned the store and served as the unofficial mayor of Fort Sumner. "Couple of drifters tried to rob the Hendricks family," Martinez said, swinging down from his saddle. He was a stocky man in his 40s, with a mustache that drooped past his chin, and a reputation for fairness that kept the peace in a town with no official law. "Old man Hendricks ran them off, but they are still out there somewhere. One of them took a bullet in the leg, so they will not get far fast." "You recognize them?" Finn asked. "Never seen them before. White men, maybe 30 years old, wearing trail dust and mean expressions." Martinez pulled off his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. "We need to organize a watch, make sure they do not come back toward town looking for supplies or horses." The men spent the next hour making arrangements, dividing up patrol routes and checking ammunition. Finn volunteered for the North Ridge, the same area where he picked flowers every morning, figuring he knew the terrain better than most. By the time everything was organized, the sun was fully up, and the day was heating toward the dry warmth that characterized New Mexico in June. He stopped by the Miller Ranch to collect his rifle and his own horse, a roan gelding named Rusty who had more endurance than speed but could handle rough country. Miller, a graying man with permanent squint lines around his eyes, listened to the news and nodded. "Take what you need," he said. "I will send my boys to watch the south pastures. Do not want anyone running off with cattle while we are distracted." Finn rode out toward the ridge, his Winchester resting across his saddle and his eyes scanning the landscape. The country around Fort Sumner was a mix of grassland and rocky outcroppings, cut through with arroyos, and the occasional stand of cottonwoods where water ran close to the surface. It was beautiful in its harsh way, all red earth and endless sky, though it was also the kind of country that could kill a man if he got careless. He spent the day riding a circuit from the ridge down to the river and back, seeing nothing more threatening than a coyote and a small herd of pronghorn antelope. The sun crawled across the sky with the patient inevitability of all desert suns, and Finn found his thoughts drifting back to Eleanor Kimball, to the way she had looked at him on the porch, to the question Mrs. Chen had raised about anonymous flowers. The truth was, he did not know what to say to a woman like Eleanor. His experience with women was limited to a few dance hall girls in cattle towns and one brief, awkward courtship with a rancher's daughter that had ended when she married someone with better prospects. Eleanor was educated, well-spoken, the kind of woman who read books and taught children grammar and probably had expectations about life that did not include a cowhand with no land and no future beyond the next job. But he thought about her constantly, had been thinking about her since the first time he saw her walking to the schoolhouse with the morning light catching in her hair. He thought about the way she carried herself, straight-backed and purposeful, and the way she looked at the children when they got something right, like their success mattered to her personally. He thought about what it would be like to make her smile, really smile, not just the polite expression she gave to everyone in town. The sun was setting when he finally headed back toward Fort Sumner, painting the ridge in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real. He stopped at the top of the ridge, looking down at the scattering of buildings that made up the settlement, at the lights beginning to appear in windows as people lit lamps against the gathering dark. Somewhere down there, Eleanor was finishing her day, maybe reading by lamplight or correcting slates or doing whatever she did with her evenings. The thought made his chest ache in a way that felt both pleasant and painful. He was about to continue down when he caught movement in the arroyo below, maybe 200 yards to the east. He reined in Rusty and watched, letting his eyes adjust to the fading light. Two figures on horseback, moving slow, one of them slumped forward in the saddle. The drifters, most likely, with the injured one struggling to stay mounted. Finn considered his options. He could ride down and confront them, but they were desperate men and desperate men were unpredictable. He could fire a warning shot and try to drive them away from town, but that might just make them panic and do something stupid. Or he could follow them, see where they were heading and get help if needed. He chose the third option, letting Rusty pick his way down the slope at a careful walk, staying far enough back that the sound would not carry. The two riders were angling northeast, away from Fort Sumner, which was good. Maybe they had decided the town was too hot and were heading for open country. But as Finn watched, they turned toward a smaller trail that led to a homestead about 3 miles out, a place belonging to a widow named Carson and her 2 children. That changed things. Finn urged Rusty into a faster pace, closing the distance while trying to stay quiet. The light was nearly gone now, just a purple glow on the western horizon, and the darkness worked in his favor. He got within 100 yards of the 2 men before one of them finally noticed him, turning in the saddle and calling out something Finn could not hear. "That is far enough," Finn called back, reining in Rusty and bringing the Winchester up. "You are heading away from town, which is smart. Keep going and there will be no trouble." "Mind your own business, Cowboy," one of them shouted back. His voice was rough, strained. "We are not bothering anyone. The Carson place is another mile up this trail. Widow and 2 kids. You are not going there." There was a pause, then the second man spoke, his voice weaker. "We need water, medical supplies. We are not looking for trouble." "You already made trouble when you tried to rob the Hendricks family," Finn said. He kept his voice level, calm, the way he would talk to a spooked horse. "Turn around. Head north. There is a spring about 5 miles that direction and a line shack that might have some supplies. After that, you keep riding." "Or what?" the first man said. He was reaching for his own weapon, a move so obvious that Finn had the Winchester trained on him before his hand reached his holster. "Or I put a bullet in you, and then another in your friend if needed. I have the high ground, the better weapon, and no injuries slowing me down. Think about your odds." The tension stretched out like wire being pulled tight. Finn could see the first man calculating, weighing his desperation against the very real possibility of getting shot. The injured man swayed in his saddle, nearly falling, and that seemed to decide things. The first man slowly moved his hand away from his gun. "Where is this spring?" he asked finally. "Follow the North Star. 5 miles, you will see a rock formation that looks like a broken tooth. Spring is at the base. Line shack is another 1/4 mile east, if you are lying." "I am not lying. I am giving you a chance to ride away. Do not make me regret it." They stared at each other for another moment. Then the first man grabbed the reins of his friend's horse and turned them both north. Finn watched until they disappeared into the darkness, then waited another 10 minutes to make sure they were really gone. His heart was pounding, his hands were sweaty on the rifle, and he felt the delayed rush of fear that came after danger passed. He rode back to Fort Sumner slowly, stopping by the general store where men were still gathered, keeping watch. He reported what had happened, and Martinez sent 2 men to check on the Carson place and make sure the drifters had really headed north. There was talk of forming a posse, but most agreed that if the men were leaving the area, it was better to let them go rather than risk more violence. It was late when Finn finally made it back to the Miller Ranch, late enough that he almost skipped the boarding house entirely. But the thought of Eleanor eating breakfast at a table with no flowers bothered him more than it should have. So he rode back toward the ridge in the darkness, trusting Rusty to find the path and carrying a lantern to search for blooms. It was foolish, picking flowers by lantern light in the middle of the night, but Finn found what he was looking for. A cluster of white evening primrose that had opened with the darkness, their petals luminous in the yellow light. He picked them carefully, the way his mother had taught him when he was young, making sure to leave enough that the plant would recover. The memory of his mother made his throat tight. She had been dead 5 years now, killed by the same influenza that had taken his younger sister. He left the flowers on Eleanor's table just after midnight, letting himself in through the back door that Mrs. Chen left unlocked for late arrivals. The boarding house was quiet, everyone asleep, and Finn moved through the darkness with the ease of long practice. He set the primrose in the small glass that served as a vase, arranging them the way he thought looked best, then stood there for a moment looking at them like an idiot before shaking his head and leaving. Sleep came hard and restless, full of dreams about gunfights and flowers and green-brown eyes that watched him with questions he could not answer. He woke before dawn, groggy and sore, and seriously considered skipping his morning ride to the ridge. But habit was stronger than exhaustion, so he saddled Rusty and made the climb just as the eastern sky was starting to lighten. The ridge was empty of everything except wildflowers and the wind that never really stopped in New Mexico. Finn dismounted and started searching, finding lupine and scarlet gilia and more Indian paintbrush. He was so focused on the flowers that he almost missed the sound of another horse approaching, and by the time he turned, Eleanor Kimball was already riding up the slope on a gray mare, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her dress traded for riding clothes that looked both practical and slightly scandalous for a schoolteacher. Finn stood there holding a handful of lupine, feeling caught, feeling exposed, and trying to figure out what to say. Eleanor reined in the mare about 10 feet away and looked at him with an expression he could not read. "So it is you," she said finally. There did not seem to be any point in denying it. "Yes. Mrs. Chen told me she saw you leaving flowers, but I did not believe her." Eleanor swung down from the mare with easy grace, the kind that spoke of years in the saddle. "I thought she was trying to play matchmaker." "Maybe she was," Finn said. His mouth felt dry. "I did not ask her to tell you. Why did not you tell me yourself?" There was no accusation in the question, just genuine curiosity. Finn looked down at the flowers in his hand, at the purple blooms that were already starting to wilt in the heat from his palm. Seemed easier this way. Easier how? Easier to leave flowers than to say something stupid. Easier to walk away than to stand there while you look at me like you are looking at me now, trying to figure out what to say that will not hurt my feelings. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and when Finn finally looked up, she was closer, near enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose. What makes you think I want to hurt your feelings? I did not say you wanted to. Just that you would have to figure out how to turn me down without being cruel about it, and that seemed like a burden I did not need to put on you. You are making a lot of assumptions about what I would say. She held out her hand. May I see those? Finn handed over the lupine, watching as she examined the flowers with careful attention. Her fingers were ink-stained, he noticed, with calluses on the side of her thumb that probably came from holding chalk or pencils for hours every day. They are beautiful, she said softly. They have all been beautiful. I pressed some of them to keep. The primrose from this morning were extraordinary. Something hot and bright flared in Finn's chest. You pressed them. I have a book full of them now. Every flower you have left for the past 5 days. She looked up at him, and her eyes were definitely more green than brown in the early light. I wanted to know who was leaving them. I wanted to thank them. I wanted. She paused, seeming to search for words. I wanted to know if the flowers meant what I hoped they meant. What did you hope they meant? That someone in this town saw me as more than the poor Eastern girl who lost her father. That someone thought I was worth the effort of climbing a ridge before dawn to pick wildflowers. She smiled, and it transformed her face from pretty to something that made Finn's breath catch. That maybe someone was interested in me the way I have been interested in them. Finn stared at her, trying to process what she was saying, trying to match it up against his own assumptions. You have been interested in me. Since the day you helped Mrs. Martinez carry her groceries when her wagon broke down. You did not make a show of it, did not act like you were doing something special. You just saw someone who needed help and provided it. And then you fixed the wagon wheel without being asked and refused payment, and I thought. She paused again, color rising in her cheeks. I thought that was the kind of man worth knowing. That was 3 months ago, I am aware. You never said anything. Neither did you. She held up the lupine. You left flowers instead. Finn felt a laugh building in his chest, slightly hysterical, mostly relieved. Mrs. Chen was right. I should have just talked to you. Mrs. Chen is usually right about these things. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that Finn could smell lavender and horse and something that might have been her own scent. But the flowers were lovely. They made me feel like someone was paying attention, like someone cared enough to put in effort. I care, Finn said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. I have cared since the first time I saw you. I just did not know how to say it without sounding like every other cowhand who sees a pretty woman and thinks he has a chance. You are not every other cowhand. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light on his sleeve. And you have more than a chance if you want it. Finn set down the rest of the flowers he had been holding and took her hand, marveling at how small it was in his own, how soft despite the calluses. I want it. I want to court you proper, if you will let me. I want to take you to dinner and talk to you and figure out if this feeling I have is real or just me being foolish. What feeling is that? Like I would climb this ridge every morning for the rest of my life if it meant seeing you smile. Like the world makes more sense when I know you are in it. He squeezed her hand gently. Like maybe I could be the kind of man worth your time if I tried hard enough. Eleanor's eyes were shining now, bright with something that might have been tears or might have been joy. You are already worth my time, Finn Yates. You have been worth my time since the day you fixed that wagon wheel. I just did not know how to tell you without seeming too forward. Please be forward, Finn said. I am clearly terrible at understanding subtle. She laughed, the sound like water over stones, and then she was in his arms somehow, or he was in hers, and they were kissing in the dawn light on the ridge with wildflowers scattered at their feet and the whole vast New Mexico sky stretching out above them. Her mouth was soft and warm, tasting faintly of the tea she must have drunk before riding out, and Finn felt like every risk he had ever taken, every mile he had ever ridden, every loss he had ever endured, had been leading him to this moment with this woman. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest. "I have wanted to do that for a very long time." "Me too," Finn admitted, "though I did not think I would get the chance." "Well, now you have gotten it. What are you going to do with it?" He pulled back enough to look down at her flushed cheeks and bright eyes and slightly swollen lips. "I suppose I should start by asking if you would like to have dinner with me, properly, where people can see us and know we are courting. I would like that very much." She smiled up at him. "Though I hope you will continue picking flowers. I have gotten rather attached to finding them on my table." "Every morning," Finn promised, "as long as you want them." They rode back to town together as the sun climbed higher, talking about everything and nothing, discovering the thousand small details that make up a person's life. Finn learned that Eleanor had taught school in Ohio before coming west with her father, that she loved reading novels and despised mathematics, but taught it anyway because the children needed it, that her mother had died when she was 16, and she had essentially raised herself after that. Eleanor learned that Finn had grown up on a small ranch in Colorado, that he had 2 older brothers who had gone east to try factory work, that his greatest fear was ending up old and alone with nothing to show for his life, but scars and regrets. "You will not end up alone," Eleanor said firmly as they approached Fort Sumner. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The town was waking up properly now, smoke rising from chimneys and doors opening as people started their daily routines. They caused something of a stir, riding in together, and Finn could see curtains twitching and heads turning. By noon, everyone in Fort Sumner would know that Finn Yates and Eleanor Kimball were keeping company, and the thought made him smile. He rode with her to the schoolhouse, helped her down from the mare, and held her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "When can I see you again? I finish teaching at 3 o'clock. If you are not busy, you could walk me home." "I will be here," Finn promised. He would have promised her the moon and stars in that moment, would have promised her anything she asked for. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Finn helped Miller with a fence that needed repairing, and tried not to think about the hours until 3 o'clock. Miller noticed his distraction and made several pointed comments about lovesick cowboys, but there was amusement in his voice rather than irritation. By 2:30, Finn had cleaned up as best he could, had changed into his least worn shirt, and was pacing outside the schoolhouse like a nervous colt. Eleanor emerged right at 3 o'clock with a gaggle of children trailing behind her, all of them chattering and showing her slates with the day's work on them. She looked up and saw Finn, and her face lit up in a way that made his heart do complicated things in his chest. She dismissed the children, endured their knowing looks and giggles, and then walked over to where he waited. "You are very punctual," she said. "Spent the last hour watching the clock," Finn admitted. "Miller thinks I am losing my mind." "Are you?" "Probably." He offered her his arm, and she took it, her hand curving around his elbow in a way that felt both natural and momentous. They started walking toward the boarding house, taking the long route that led past the general store and the church. Over the next weeks, they fell into a pattern that felt like the beginning of something permanent. Finn picked flowers every morning, left them on Eleanor's table, and then showed up at the schoolhouse every afternoon to walk her home. They had dinner together 3 times a week at the boarding house, where Mrs. Chen served them with a satisfaction that suggested she considered their courtship a personal achievement. On Sundays, they attended church together, sitting in the back pew and trying not to be too obvious about holding hands during the sermon. Finn learned that Eleanor snored slightly when she fell asleep, which he discovered one evening when she dozed off during a church social, her head on his shoulder. Eleanor learned that Finn could not carry a tune to save his life, but hummed anyway when he was happy, a tuneless sound that nevertheless made her smile. They talked about everything, their pasts, their fears, their hopes for the future. Finn told her about losing his family's ranch, about the helplessness of watching years of work disappear because of weather and debt. Eleanor told him about the loneliness of being an educated woman in a society that did not quite know what to do with her, about the frustration of having intelligence and opinions that people often dismissed because of her gender. "You never dismiss me," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and gold. "You listen when I talk, like what I say matters." "It does matter," Finn said. He was holding her hand, their fingers interlaced, and he could not imagine a future that did not include this exact moment repeated endlessly. "Everything you say matters. You are the smartest person I know." "I am not smart enough to figure out how to make the territorial government send more supplies for the school. The children need books, Finn. Real books, not the handful of tattered primers we have been sharing. What if we raised money? Had a dance or a social, charged admission and used it to buy books?" Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "That is a brilliant idea. Why did not I think of that?" "Because you were too busy being frustrated to think sideways at the problem." He grinned at her. "One of my few talents, thinking sideways." They organized the fundraiser together, spending evenings making plans and recruiting help. The town responded with enthusiasm, the kind that small communities show when given a project that benefits everyone. The women organized food, the men built a platform for dancing, and Samuel Porter donated space at his store for decorations. Finn found himself in the strange position of being part of something larger than himself, part of a community effort that felt meaningful in a way that ranch work never quite had. The dance was held on a Saturday in early July, when the heat was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the evening brought relief in the form of a slight breeze. The platform had been set up in the open space between the church and the general store, with lanterns strung overhead and musicians tuning their instruments in the corner. People came from homesteads as far as 10 miles out, families dressed in their best clothes, eager for entertainment and the chance to socialize. Finn wore his only suit, a slightly outdated garment that had belonged to his father and fit him reasonably well after Eleanor had taken in the seams. She wore a dress of deep green that made her eyes look like emeralds, with her hair styled in a way that must have taken hours but looked effortless. When she walked up to him, Finn forgot how to breathe for a moment. "You look beautiful," he managed finally. "You look quite handsome yourself." She smiled up at him, then glanced around at the crowd. "I cannot believe how many people came. You are a good teacher. People want to support the school. People want an excuse to dance and eat pie," Eleanor corrected, but she was still smiling. "But I will take it." The music started, a lively fiddle tune that got people moving onto the platform. Finn had never been much of a dancer, but he gamely led Eleanor into the crowd and tried to remember the steps his mother had taught him years ago. He stepped on Eleanor's feet twice, apologized profusely both times, and finally found a rhythm that allowed them to move together without causing injury. "You are terrible at this," Eleanor said, laughing, her cheeks flushed from the heat and the movement. "I warned you I had limited talents." "You have plenty of talents. Dancing just is not one of them." They danced anyway, song after song, until they were both sweating and breathless and grinning like children. When the musicians finally took a break, Finn bought them both lemonade from the refreshment table, and they found a relatively quiet spot at the edge of the crowd. "This is the best night I have had since coming to Fort Sumner," Eleanor said softly. "Maybe the best night I have had in years." "Me too," Finn admitted. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that every night with her was the best night, that he was falling in love with her so fast and so hard that it terrified him, but the words seemed too big for the moment. Instead, he just held her hand and watched the dancers swirl across the platform. The fundraiser was a success, raising enough money to purchase 24 new books and supplies for the school. Eleanor cried when the books arrived, actual tears streaming down her face as she unpacked them and ran her fingers over the covers. Finn stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and watched her, feeling a fierce protectiveness mixed with pride. This woman, this brilliant, passionate woman, was choosing to spend her time with him. The thought was both humbling and exhilarating. Summer deepened into the scorching heat of August, when the land baked under a relentless sun, and every living thing moved slowly to conserve energy. The school closed for a month, giving Eleanor time to work on lesson plans and enjoy the relative freedom of having her days to herself. She and Finn spent more time together, often riding out to the river in the early mornings when the air was still cool, sitting in the shade of the cottonwoods and talking about nothing and everything. It was during one of these mornings, with the water murmuring past and a mockingbird singing in the branches overhead, that Finn finally said what he had been thinking for weeks. "I love you," he said simply, the words falling into the quiet like stones into water. "I know it has not been that long, and I know I do not have much to offer, but I love you, Eleanor. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Finn felt his heart hammering against his ribs, fear and hope tangled together into something almost painful. Then she turned to him, her eyes bright, and took his face in her hands. "I love you too," she said, her voice fierce and certain. "I have loved you since you started leaving flowers on my table, maybe even before that, and you have plenty to offer, Finn Yates. You have yourself, and that is more than enough." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, trying to pour every emotion he could not name into the press of his mouth against hers. When they finally broke apart, they were both shaking slightly, overwhelmed by the weight of what they had just admitted. "I want to marry you," Finn said. "I know I should wait longer, should court you properly for a year or more, but I do not want to wait. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to spend my life making you happy." "Then ask me," Eleanor said softly. "Ask me properly." Finn slid off the fallen log where they had been sitting and knelt in the dirt beside the river, taking her hand in his. "Eleanor Kimball, will you marry me? I do not have a ring yet, and I do not have much money or land or anything else that matters, but I will spend every day of my life being the man you deserve. I will pick you flowers and make you laugh and stand beside you through whatever comes. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Eleanor said, and she was crying and laughing at the same time, pulling him up from the ground and into her arms. "Yes, of course, yes." They were married 6 weeks later in early October, when the heat had finally broken and the evenings were cool enough to make being outside pleasant. The wedding was held at the small church in Fort Sumner, with the entire town in attendance and flowers covering every available surface. Finn had spent days gathering blooms from the ridge and the river valley, creating arrangements that turned the simple building into something magical. Eleanor wore a dress that Mrs. Chen and several other women had helped her sew, white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers Finn had been picking for months. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, but every word felt weighted with significance. When Finn slipped the simple gold band onto Eleanor's finger, a ring he had purchased with money saved from months of careful work, his hands were shaking. When Eleanor promised to love and honor him for the rest of her life, her voice was steady and sure, and Finn felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that he had been searching for without knowing it. They held the reception at the boarding house, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed everyone twice over. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts, and more laughter than Finn could remember experiencing in his entire life. Miller gave a speech about how Finn had been useless for the past 4 months, too distracted by love to properly mend a fence, but that he supposed it was worth it to see him this happy. Mrs. Chen presented them with a set of dishes wrapped in cloth, her eyes suspiciously bright. Samuel Porter announced that he had arranged for them to rent the small house at the edge of town, the one with the garden and the porch, and that the first month's rent was a wedding gift from the community. As the sun set and the party continued, Finn and Eleanor slipped away from the crowd and walked to their new home, their hands clasped together, their futures stretching out before them like an unwritten story. The house was small, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Someone had already brought in their few possessions, had made up the bed with clean sheets and left a lamp burning in the window. They stood in the doorway together, looking at this space that would become their life, and Finn felt a rush of emotion so strong it nearly knocked him over. This was real. This was happening. He had a wife, a home, a future that looked nothing like the lonely drifting he had been doing for years. "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked softly, leaning against his shoulder. "I did not know I could be this happy," Finn admitted. "I did not know this kind of happiness existed." She turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that held the lamplight like captured stars. "We are going to have a good life, Finn. I can feel it." "We are going to have a great life," he corrected. And then he kissed her, carrying her over the threshold and into the home they would build together. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to share space and make decisions together, navigating the 1,000 tiny compromises that make up a life lived in partnership. Finn continued working for Miller, though he started looking for opportunities to build something of his own. Eleanor returned to teaching when school resumed in September, her classroom bright with the new books and her students eager after their summer break. They established routines, rhythms that felt comfortable. Finn still picked flowers most mornings, leaving them on the kitchen table now instead of the boarding house. Eleanor still pressed them into her book, creating a record of their days together. That first winter was mild by New Mexico standards, with only occasional cold snaps and no serious snow. They spent evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply sitting in comfortable silence, Finn mending tack while Eleanor graded slates. On Sundays, they had dinner with Mrs. Chen, or with the Miller family, and slowly, Finn began to feel like he had roots going down into this place, connections that anchored him in a way he had not felt since leaving Colorado. In February, Eleanor told him she was pregnant. They were having breakfast, the morning sun streaming through the kitchen window, and she just said it plainly, without preamble or drama. "I am going to have a baby. Sometime in early September, the doctor thinks." Finn dropped his fork, staring at her with his mouth open like a landed fish. "You are certain?" The doctor confirmed it yesterday. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." She was watching him carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. "Are you pleased?" Pleased seemed like too small a word for what Finn was feeling. He got up from his chair, pulled Eleanor into his arms, and held her so tightly she made a small noise of protest. "I am beyond pleased. I am terrified and thrilled and completely unprepared, but mostly I am happy. So incredibly happy." "We are going to need a bigger house eventually," Eleanor pointed out, her voice muffled against his chest. "Then we will get a bigger house, or build one, whatever you need." The pregnancy progressed normally, though Eleanor suffered from morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon for the first few months. Finn hovered anxiously, trying to be helpful and mostly just getting in the way, until Eleanor finally banned him from the house during the worst of it, telling him to go work and stop watching her like she might break. The school year ended in May, and Eleanor reluctantly informed the parents that she would not be able to teach the following year, at least not for the first part of it. The town rallied again, finding a replacement teacher and organizing a surprise celebration for Eleanor, showering her with baby clothes and blankets and advice. The summer heat was brutal during the final months of her pregnancy, and Eleanor spent most of her time in the shade, fanning herself and complaining good-naturedly about being too hot and too large and too uncomfortable. Finn did everything he could to make her comfortable, including installing a system of wet sheets over the windows that cooled the house when the breeze blew through, a trick he had learned from Mrs. Chen. Their son was born on September 8th, after a labor that lasted 14 hours and left Finn a wreck of nerves pacing outside the bedroom door. The midwife finally allowed him in just as the baby arrived, and Finn watched in awe as this tiny, red, screaming creature came into the world. Eleanor was exhausted, her hair plastered to her face with sweat, but she was smiling as the midwife cleaned the baby and placed him in her arms. "We have a son," she said wonderingly, looking down at the infant with an expression of absolute adoration. Finn knelt beside the bed, touching the baby's impossibly small hand with one finger, watching as the tiny fingers curled around his own. "He is perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly over the past months, debating options and rejecting them, unable to agree on anything. But looking at his son now, Finn knew. "Thomas, after your father, Thomas Yates." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears and she nodded. "Thomas, it is perfect." Adjusting to life with an infant was harder than Finn had anticipated. Thomas was a fussy baby, prone to crying at all hours and requiring constant attention. Eleanor was exhausted, struggling with nursing and recovery, and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. Finn tried to help, walking the floor with Thomas during the night, changing diapers with fumbling hands, but he felt inadequate most of the time, unable to provide the comfort that Eleanor could. But there were also moments of transcendent joy, watching Thomas sleep in Eleanor's arms, his tiny face peaceful and perfect. Seeing him smile for the first time, a real smile that lit up his whole face. The first time he laughed, a gurgling sound that made both parents stop and stare in wonder. These moments made the exhaustion worthwhile, made the sacrifices seem small. Miller, recognizing that Finn needed better income to support his growing family, offered him a partnership in a horse breeding venture. It required an investment that Finn did not quite have, but Eleanor insisted they use the money her father had left her, the small inheritance that had been sitting untouched in the bank. "This is what he would have wanted," she said firmly, "an investment in our future." The business proved successful. Finn had a natural talent for working with horses, a patience and understanding that produced animals known for their temperament and stamina. Word spread beyond Fort Sumner, and soon buyers were coming from as far as Santa Fe and Albuquerque to purchase stock. The income was irregular but substantial, and for the first time in his life, Finn began to feel financially secure. They bought land 3 miles outside of town, 160 acres with a good spring and enough grass to support a decent herd. Finn and Miller, along with several hired men, built a house over the course of that winter and the following spring. It was nothing fancy, but it was solid and spacious, with 3 bedrooms and a wide porch that looked out over the valley. They moved in when Thomas was 18 months old, and Eleanor cried as she walked through the rooms, touching walls and windows like she could not quite believe they were real. "Our house," she said softly. "Really ours." "Really ours," Finn agreed. He was holding Thomas, who was squirming and demanding to be put down, and he looked around at this space they had created and felt pride settle warm in his chest. "We did good, did not we? We did wonderful." Life on the ranch was different from life in town, more isolated but also more free. Eleanor set up a small classroom in one of the bedrooms and began tutoring children from neighboring homesteads, teaching them reading and arithmetic a few days a week. Finn worked from before dawn until after dark, building corrals and breaking horses and slowly expanding their operation. Thomas grew from a fussy infant into an active toddler, constantly getting into everything and keeping them both on their toes. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara, was born in the spring of 1882, 3 years after Thomas. The birth was easier than the first, and Eleanor recovered quickly, though she was kept busy managing a newborn and a rambunctious 3-year-old. Clara was a calm baby, the opposite of her brother, content to lie in her cradle and watch the world with serious eyes. Finn fell in love with her instantly. This tiny girl with Eleanor's eyes and a temperament that seemed almost preternaturally patient. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and slow growth. The horse business continued to thrive, and Finn hired 2 full-time hands to help with the daily work. They added cattle to their operation, a small herd that provided additional income. Eleanor continued teaching and became known throughout the region as an excellent instructor. Thomas started formal lessons when he turned 6, learning to read and write at his mother's knee, and Clara followed as soon as she was old enough to hold a pencil. There were challenges, of course. A drought in 1884 that killed half their cattle and required them to dig deeper wells. A bout of scarlet fever that swept through the area and left Thomas dangerously ill for 2 weeks. A fall from a horse that broke Finn's leg and laid him up for months, unable to work properly. But they weathered each crisis together, leaning on each other and on the community they had built around them. In 1886, when Thomas was 7 and Clara was 4, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she was less anxious about it, though she admitted to Finn that she felt too old to be having babies at 31. Finn, now 34 and feeling the years in his back and knees, secretly agreed, but he was excited nonetheless about expanding their family. Their third child, another son they named James, was born in December, a winter baby who arrived during a rare snowstorm. The midwife almost did not make it in time, the roads being nearly impassable, but she managed to arrive an hour before James made his entrance into the world. He was a big baby, over 9 pounds, and the birth was difficult, leaving Eleanor exhausted and swearing she would never have another child. "I mean it," she told Finn as he held James for the first time, marveling at the baby's size. "3 is enough. We are done." "3 is perfect," Finn agreed. He was watching Eleanor, noting the exhaustion in her face, the pallor of her skin, and feeling worried despite the successful delivery. "You rest. I will handle everything else." They hired a woman from town to help with the household work and the children for the first few months, giving Eleanor time to recover. It took longer than it had with the previous 2 births, and there were a few weeks where Finn was genuinely scared, watching Eleanor struggle with exhaustion and pain. But slowly she healed, regaining her strength and her usual energy, and by the time spring arrived, she was back to teaching and managing the household with her customary efficiency. The children grew, as children do, each developing their own personalities and interests. Thomas was serious and studious, fascinated by books and learning, and Finn suspected he would end up doing something far removed from ranching. Clara was quieter, with a love for animals that rivaled her father's, and she could often be found in the barn talking to the horses or hand-feeding orphaned calves. James was still too young to show much personality, but he seemed to have inherited his mother's determination, refusing to give up on anything he set his mind to, whether it was learning to walk or reaching a toy that was just out of reach. By 1890, the ranch was fully established and profitable. They employed 6 full-time hands, ran 300 head of cattle and 50 horses, and had become one of the more successful operations in the region. Finn, now 38, had developed a reputation as a fair employer and a knowledgeable horseman. Eleanor, at 35, was still teaching, though she had cut back her hours to focus more on their own children's education. On a morning in June of that year, Finn woke early as usual and lay in bed for a moment, watching Eleanor sleep beside him. She was still beautiful, though there were lines around her eyes now and silver threading through her dark hair. They had been married for 11 years, and Finn loved her more now than he had on their wedding day, a deeper, richer love built on years of shared experiences and mutual respect. He slipped out of bed quietly, dressed, and went outside to watch the sunrise. It was a habit he had maintained throughout their marriage, this quiet moment before the day began. He walked out to the ridge that overlooked their land, the same ridge where he had picked flowers all those years ago, and stood looking down at the house and barns and corrals they had built together. The wildflowers were blooming again, as they did every June, splashes of color across the brown grass. Finn knelt and picked a handful, moving with the same methodical care he had used when loading his rifle for patrol all those years ago, making sure each stem was clean and each flower perfect. The motion was familiar, comforting, a connection to the young man he had been and the life he had built. He walked back to the house as the sun climbed higher, finding Eleanor already awake and making coffee in the kitchen. She looked up as he entered, saw the flowers in his hand, and smiled the smile that still made his heart do complicated things in his chest. "You still pick them," she said softly. "Every June," Finn agreed. He put the flowers in a jar on the table, arranging them the way she liked. "Seemed important to remember how this started. With flowers on my table." "With flowers on your table," he confirmed. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling grateful for every single day they had been given. "Best decision I ever made, picking those flowers. Best decision I ever made was riding up that ridge to confront the mysterious flower giver." She leaned back to look up at him, her eyes bright. "Think we would have figured it out eventually if I had not." "Eventually," Finn said. "I was working up the courage to talk to you. Would have just taken me another year or two." Eleanor laughed, the sound as warm and rich as it had been when they were courting. "I am glad I saved us the time." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other as the coffee percolated on the stove and the children started to wake in their rooms upstairs. Through the window, Finn could see the ranch spreading out in the morning light, could see the horses in the pasture and the cattle dotting the hills. It was more than he had ever imagined having, more than he had dreamed was possible during those years of drifting and loss. "I love you," he said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them by the river. "I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, kissing him softly. "My flower-picking cowboy." The years continued to roll past, bringing changes and challenges and joys. Thomas, as Finn had suspected, showed little interest in ranching and instead pursued an education. eventually attending the university in Albuquerque and becoming a lawyer. Clara stayed on the ranch, working alongside her father and showing a natural talent for horse breeding that surpassed even Finn's. James, the youngest, proved to have a head for business and took over the financial management of the ranch while still in his teens. Finn and Eleanor watched their children grow and leave, and in Clara's case, stay, and they adjusted to the changing rhythms of their life. There were grandchildren eventually, first from Thomas, and then from James, babies who visited during summers and holidays and brought new energy to the ranch. Eleanor loved being a grandmother, loved spoiling the children and sending them home sugared up and overtired. In 1905, when Finn was 53 and Eleanor was 50, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a party that drew people from all over the territory, now officially the state of New Mexico. The community they had become part of all those years ago had grown and changed, but the core remained the same. People who looked out for each other, who showed up when needed, who celebrated successes and mourned losses together. Mrs. Chen, now elderly and retired from running the boarding house, attended with her grown children and gave a speech about how she had known from the start that Finn and Eleanor were meant for each other. Miller, grayer and slower but still sharp, told embarrassing stories about Finn's early days as a lovesick cowhand. There were toasts and laughter, dancing and music, and at the center of it all were Finn and Eleanor, hands clasped, surrounded by the life they had built. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Finn and Eleanor walked together to the ridge, retracing the path Finn had taken so many times over the years. The wildflowers were blooming again, as they always did in June, and the sunset was painting the sky in familiar shades of red and gold. 25 years, Eleanor said softly, looking out over the land they had shaped together. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I know what you mean. Finn put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Best 25 years of my life. Mine too. She leaned against him, comfortable in the silence that years of marriage had made easy. Then she smiled. You still owe me flowers tomorrow morning. I will pick them before dawn, Finn promised. Same as always. Same as always, Eleanor echoed, and in those words was the whole history of their love. Consistent, steadfast, growing deeper with each passing year. They stood on the ridge as darkness fell, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. And Finn thought about the young man he had been, lonely and drifting and picking flowers like he was loading a rifle for battle. He had not known then what he was fighting for, had not understood that the flowers were the first shot in a campaign that would win him everything that mattered. But he understood now. He understood that love was built in small actions repeated over time, in flowers picked at dawn and placed on tables, in words spoken and promises kept, in years of showing up and choosing each other day after day. He understood that the wildflowers had been an offering, yes, but also a prayer, a hope cast into the universe that someone might see him and find him worthy of love. Eleanor had seen him. Eleanor had found him worthy. And together, they had built something that would outlast them both. A family, a home, a legacy of love that started with wildflowers on a table and grew into something vast and beautiful and enduring. As they walked back to the house, hands clasped in the darkness, Finn knew that if he had to do it all over again, he would make the same choices, take the same risks, pick the same flowers. Because every single stem, every single bloom, every single dawn trip to the ridge had led him here, to this moment, to this woman, to this life, and it had been worth it. Every flower, every fear, every moment of uncertainty had been worth it for this. walking hand in hand with Eleanor Yates under the New Mexico stars, heading home to the house they had built, surrounded by the love they had grown together like wildflowers on a ridge, beautiful and resilient and forever blooming. The end of their story was still years away, decades even, but the foundation was set, solid and sure. They would grow old together on this land, would watch their grandchildren have children of their own, would measure their lives not in accomplishments or acquisitions, but in moments of connection, in laughter shared and challenges overcome, in the quiet comfort of another morning together. Finn continued to pick flowers every June for the rest of his life, carrying on the tradition that had started his courtship. Even when his hands grew arthritic and the climb became difficult, he made the trip to the ridge, moving slowly but with the same methodical care he had always used. Eleanor pressed each bunch into her book, which had long since expanded into multiple volumes, a chronicle of their years together written in petals and stems. When Finn died in 1924 at the age of 72, it was peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Eleanor for 49 years. She found him in the morning, looking peaceful, and though her heart broke, she also felt grateful for every single day they had been given. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of New Mexico, people whose lives Finn and Eleanor had touched over their decades in Fort Sumner. Eleanor lived another 8 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on the stories of their life and the lessons they had learned. She kept the house on the ridge, kept Finn's side of the bed made up, and every June she would ask Clara to pick wildflowers and bring them to her, so she could press them into the book one last time. When she died in 1932, at the age of 77, they buried her beside Finn on the ridge overlooking the ranch, in sight of the places where he had picked so many flowers over so many years. The family placed wildflowers on both graves, a tradition they would continue for generations. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Clara and her children, and the house that Finn and Eleanor had built remained standing, a testament to what they had created together. The books full of pressed flowers were preserved, eventually donated to the Historical Society, where they became a cherished record of a love story that had started with a simple gesture and grown into something legendary. People in Fort Sumner still told the story of the cowboy who picked wildflowers like he was loading a rifle, who placed them on a table for a woman he had not yet had the courage to speak to, and how that simple action had started a love that lasted half a century and created a legacy that endured long after both of them were gone. It was a story about persistence and courage, about the willingness to be vulnerable and the faith that love was worth fighting for. It was a story about two people who found each other in a harsh land during a hard time and chose to build something beautiful together. It was a story about flowers and tables, about dawn trips to a ridge and promises kept over decades, about the small actions that accumulate into a life well lived. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple, the kind that reminds us that romance is not just about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but about showing up consistently, about seeing someone truly and choosing them again and again, about picking flowers at dawn because it makes someone smile, and building a life together one day, one choice, one wildflower at a time.